My name is Victoria Hayes. I was 25 years old the night my parents demanded $93,000 for my sister's wedding. Not asked, not suggested, demanded. And when I refused, my father stood up in front of 30 relatives and said 7 words that changed the way I saw my family forever. Then maybe you're not family anymore. The room went silent. My sister Chloe burst into tears. My mother wrapped an arm around her shoulders. Several relatives stared at me like I had committed some terrible crime. Nobody asked whether I could afford $93,000. Nobody asked whether I wanted to pay. The decision had already been made before I arrived. The strange part? That wasn't even the worst thing that happened. 3 weeks later, I opened a metal box my grandfather had left behind. Inside was enough evidence to destroy 10 years of lies. But that came later. The story started on Christmas Eve. I live in Richmond, Virginia. I'm a senior financial analyst. My life is stable but far from glamorous. I own a small townhouse, drive a 6-year-old sedan, and spend most of my days working with budgets, forecasts, and spreadsheets. Everything I have came from planning and discipline. My younger sister Chloe was different. She was charming, outgoing, the type of person people immediately liked. Unfortunately, she also had a habit of spending money she didn't have. And whenever that happened, my parents somehow found a way to rescue her. 3 days before Christmas, my mother sent a group text. Big family dinner Sunday, important wedding announcement. Everyone be there. The moment I read it, I knew it would be about Chloe's wedding. She'd gotten engaged 4 months earlier to Daniel Mercer. Daniel came from a wealthy family that owned several commercial properties throughout Virginia. I liked Daniel. He worked hard, treated people well. The problem wasn't Daniel. The problem was that every wedding update Chloe posted online looked more expensive than the last. Luxury venues, designer dresses, private tastings, professional planners, everything about it screamed money. By the time I drove to my parents' house on Christmas Eve, I already had a bad feeling. I just didn't know how bad. The first hour felt normal. Relatives filled the house. Children ran through hallways. People exchanged gifts and caught up on life. Then my mother stood and tapped her glass. The room quieted immediately. As most of you know, Chloe and Daniel are getting married this summer. Applause filled the room. My mother smiled proudly. They've found the perfect venue. More applause. The perfect photographer. More applause. Then she delivered the number. The wedding budget is $93,000. Several relatives looked impressed. I nearly choked on my drink. $93,000 for one day? Before I could process the number, my mother turned toward me. Victoria, your father and I have discussed this carefully. Every conversation stopped. Every face turned toward me. A knot formed in my stomach. Then she said it. We want you to pay for the wedding. For a moment, I honestly thought she was joking. Nobody decides to spend $93,000 of someone else's money without asking them first. Apparently, my family did. I looked at my father. He nodded calmly, like this was perfectly reasonable. I looked at Chloe, then Daniel. Daniel looked shocked, which told me he hadn't known about this either. I slowly set down my fork. $93,000? Yes. For one wedding? Yes. And you already decided I would pay for it? My mother's smile weakened. It isn't like that. It sounds exactly like that. Chloe immediately started crying. The room shifted toward her. Comforting words, sympathetic looks. Nobody looked at me. Nobody asked how I felt. The conversation instantly became about protecting Chloe from hearing the word no. I folded my hands together. How much are Mom and Dad contributing? Silence. I looked at Chloe. How much are you contributing? More silence. Then my mother spoke. That's not the point. Actually, it was exactly the point, because nobody wanted to admit what everyone already knew. They expected me to pay for almost everything. My father stood. "Your sister needs this." Needs, like a $93,000 wedding, was food or medicine. I shook my head. No. The room froze. My mother's expression changed immediately. "What do you mean, no?" "I mean, no." My father stared at me for several seconds. Then he delivered the sentence I would never forget. "If you won't help your family, then maybe you're not family anymore." Silence. Complete silence. I looked around the room, at my parents, at Chloe, at relatives who suddenly seemed more interested in my money than my place in the family. Then I stood, picked up my purse, and looked directly at my parents. If $93,000 is the cost of being family, then you've already made your decision. Nobody stopped me. Nobody defended me. I walked out into the cold December night. At the time, I thought the wedding demand was the real story. I was wrong, because 11 days later, a lawyer would hand me a metal box my grandfather left behind. And inside that box was proof that my family hadn't just been using me for one wedding. They had been doing it for years. 11 days after Christmas, I was sitting in my office reviewing quarterly reports when my phone rang. The number was unfamiliar. Normally, I let unknown calls go to voicemail. For some reason, I answered. "Victoria Hayes?" "Speaking." "My name is Robert Mills. I handled your grandfather Walter Hayes' estate." I sat up straighter. My grandfather had been gone for almost a year. "I need to meet with you." The seriousness in his voice immediately caught my attention. "Why?" There was a brief pause. "Because your grandfather left instructions that were only supposed to be followed under specific circumstances." My stomach tightened. "What circumstances?" Another pause. Then he said something I wasn't expecting. "A serious financial dispute within the family." For a moment I couldn't speak. My mind immediately went back to Christmas dinner, the wedding demand, the ultimatum, the threat, the $93,000. "When can we meet?" I asked. "Tomorrow afternoon." The next day I drove to his office. A single metal lockbox sat in the middle of the table. Nothing else, just the box. Mr. Mills slid a small key toward me. "Your grandfather left very specific instructions." I stared at the box. "What is it?" "I honestly don't know." That surprised me. "You never opened it?" "No." He shook his head. "Your grandfather paid me to store it, that's all." My pulse quickened. Walter Hayes wasn't the kind of man who did things dramatically. He was an accountant, a veteran, a man who believed facts mattered more than opinions. If he left something behind, it meant something. I picked up the key, inserted it into the lock, and turned. The metal latch clicked open. Inside were 3 items: a letter, a flash drive, and a thick stack of documents. The envelope had my name written across the front, in my grandfather's handwriting. "For Victoria, only if the truth matters." I opened the letter first. The very first sentence made my heart skip. "Victoria, if you're reading this, someone in our family has finally asked too much." I read the sentence twice, then continued. Over the next 2 pages, my grandfather explained that several years before his death, he began noticing financial transactions that didn't make sense. Transfers, withdrawals, missing balances, money moving between accounts without clear explanations. At first, he assumed there was a reasonable answer. Then he started checking, quietly, carefully, the way accountants check everything. Eventually, he reached a conclusion. And that conclusion was written plainly on the second page. "I believe your parents have spent years financially protecting Chloe at the expense of everyone around her, including you." I lowered the letter. My grandfather wasn't guessing. He wasn't speculating. He was documenting. That was how he approached everything. Facts first, emotions second. I continued reading. The documents enclosed contain records I collected before my death. If I'm wrong, destroy them. If I'm right, you'll know exactly what they mean. My hands felt heavier as I set the letter down. Then I reached for the documents. The pattern became obvious surprisingly fast. Whenever Chloe had a financial problem, money appeared. Again and again and again. The amounts grew larger every year. Thousands, then tens of thousands. I wasn't shocked that Chloe had received help. What shocked me was where some of that money came from. About halfway through the stack, I found an account number that looked familiar. Very familiar. I checked it again, then a third time. My stomach dropped. It belonged to my college fund. A fund my parents claimed had been exhausted years ago. According to them, tuition had consumed everything. The records told a different story. More than $20,000 had been transferred elsewhere. Not to a university, not to tuition, not to educational expenses, to an account connected to my parents, and eventually connected to Chloe. I stared at the page, then found another transfer, and another. By the time I finished, one thing was clear. The money hadn't disappeared. It had been redirected, quietly, over years, toward Chloe. The room suddenly felt smaller. I leaned back in my chair and closed my eyes. The wedding demand wasn't an isolated event. It was part of a much larger pattern, a pattern that had been happening for years without my knowledge. I plugged the flash drive into my laptop. Dozens of files appeared. Statements, emails, property records, trust documents, everything carefully organized, exactly the way my grandfather would organize evidence. I spent nearly 3 hours going through the files. The deeper I looked, the worse it became. Every document seemed to support the same conclusion. Whenever Chloe needed help, someone else paid for it. Usually my parents, sometimes my grandfather, and more than once, me, without my knowledge. By the time I finished reviewing the files, the office outside the conference room had almost emptied. Robert Mills returned carrying a cup of coffee. "You've been in here a while." I nodded. He looked at the documents spread across the table. "I take it you found something?" I laughed once, a short, humorless laugh. "That's one way to describe it." He sat down across from me. "Did your grandfather ever mention any of this?" "No." Robert nodded slowly. "That sounds like Walter." I looked at the stack of records. Why didn't he tell me sooner? He thought about that for a moment, then answered, "Because he hoped he was wrong." I stared at the documents. Unfortunately, he wasn't. That night I took everything home, every statement, every transfer record, every file from the flash drive, and for the first time since Christmas dinner, I stopped thinking about the wedding, because the wedding wasn't the real problem anymore. The real problem was that my family had spent years telling one story, and the records were telling another, and the more I compared those stories, the harder it became to ignore the truth. By midnight, my dining room table was covered in documents, bank statements, notes, highlighted pages, timelines. Patterns were beginning to emerge. Patterns that explained far more than a wedding budget. And hidden somewhere inside those records was proof that this hadn't started when Chloe became an adult. It had started much earlier than I ever imagined. The next morning, I called in sick. Not because I was ill, because I couldn't focus on anything except the documents covering my dining room table. For years, I had accepted my parents' version of events. Chloe struggled, Victoria succeeded. Therefore, Chloe needed more help. Simple, reasonable, fair. At least, that's what I had always believed. The records told a different story. I spent the morning organizing dates and transactions into a timeline. The deeper I went, the more disturbing the pattern became. The financial favoritism hadn't started when Chloe became an adult. It hadn't started when she got engaged. It hadn't even started in college. It started when we were teenagers. Around noon, I opened a folder labeled Education Records. Inside were documents I had never seen before. Savings statements, school payment records, letters. The first page made my stomach drop. In 2007, my grandfather had deposited identical education funds for both granddaughters. Same amount, same conditions, same starting balance. For years, I believed my college fund had simply run out. That wasn't true. The statements showed something very different. Withdrawals had been made long before I ever started college. Every withdrawal carried the same authorization. Margaret Hayes, my mother. I kept reading. The pattern was impossible to ignore. Whenever Chloe needed something extra, money disappeared from my side, piece by piece, year after year. I leaned back in my chair. Suddenly, memories I had never questioned started making sense. At the time, I believed them. Now I wasn't so sure. The problem wasn't a lack of money. The problem was where the money was going. Around 3 that afternoon, my phone rang. Daniel. I answered immediately. Hey. His voice sounded exhausted. Victoria, can we talk? Of course. There was a pause. Then he said something that immediately got my attention. I think Chloe lied to me. I sat up straighter. What happened? My parents found out about the wedding situation. That surprised me. And? They told me something Chloe never mentioned. I waited. Daniel exhaled slowly. My parents offered $50,000 for the wedding months ago. For a moment, I thought I had misheard him. 50,000? Yes. Half the wedding budget, already available, already offered. Yet somehow my family still demanded $93,000 from me. Did Chloe tell you? No. His voice sounded disappointed. Apparently she didn't want anyone using my family's money. I stared out the window. Rain tapped softly against the glass, and she wanted mine instead. Daniel didn't answer. He didn't need to. We both knew it was true. Before hanging up, he said something else. Victoria, I honestly didn't know any of this. I know. And I believed him, because unlike everyone else, Daniel actually sounded shocked. After the call ended, I returned to the documents. A few hours later, I found something even worse. A folder labeled Property Records. At first, it didn't seem important. Then I noticed an address I recognized immediately. My parents' lake cabin. The cabin had been part of family conversations for years. Dad always referred to it as the future inheritance. The place both daughters would eventually share. At least, that's what we'd always been told. I opened the file. Tax records, ownership documents, transfer forms, then a signed transfer agreement, 5 years old. I read it once, then again, then a third time, because I couldn't believe what I was seeing. Ownership of the cabin had already been transferred, not jointly, not equally, entirely to Chloe, 5 years earlier, without telling anyone, without discussing it, without mentioning it. The future inheritance had already been given away. I sat there staring at the page, every promise, every assurance, every speech about fairness, gone. The cabin alone was worth more than $200,000, and Chloe already owned it, secretly. A cold realization settled over me. If Chloe already had the cabin, if she had already received years of financial support, if Daniel's family had already offered $50,000, then why were my parents still demanding $93,000 from me? The answer came 2 days later, and it arrived completely by accident. My Aunt Linda called. Unlike most relatives, Linda had one quality I always appreciated. She told the truth, even when it was uncomfortable. She sounded nervous. Victoria, I probably shouldn't be saying this. My attention sharpened immediately. Saying what? There was a brief pause, then she lowered her voice. Your mother has been telling everyone you're rich. I laughed in disbelief. I wish. No, seriously. Linda sounded frustrated. She tells people you have hundreds of thousands saved. Suddenly everything clicked into place. The relatives, the pressure, the judgment, the disappointment. They weren't reacting to reality, they were reacting to a story my mother had created. In her version, Victoria Hayes was wealthy, selfish, and refusing to help her struggling sister. In reality, I had a mortgage, student loans, retirement savings, and a budget I followed carefully every month. I wasn't rich, I was responsible. My mother had turned responsibility into obligation. The moment Aunt Linda ended the call, I knew exactly what I needed to do. Not argue, not defend myself, not explain. Present evidence, facts, documents, proof, nothing else. That evening, I began building a timeline. Every transfer, every bailout, every hidden gift, every lie. Everything supported by records. Hour after hour, the document grew. By midnight, it was over 40 pages. By 2 a.m, it had reached 50. When I finally finished, I stared at the title page. The Hayes Family Financial History, 10 Years of Lies. For the first time since Christmas dinner, I felt calm. Not angry, not hurt. Calm. Because the truth was finally organized. And once the truth is organized, it becomes very difficult to hide. 3 days later, my mother sent a group text. Family meeting, Sunday, 2 p.m. Everyone expected to attend. I looked at the message, then at the binder sitting beside me. For weeks, my family had been preparing a meeting to convince me to pay for the wedding. What they didn't realize was that I had spent those same weeks preparing a meeting of my own. And when Sunday arrived, only one version of the story was going to survive. Sunday arrived cold and gray. I parked outside my parents' house carrying a binder filled with 10 years of records. When I walked inside, nearly a dozen relatives were already waiting. My mother sat at the head of the table, my father beside her, Chloe and Daniel across from them. The moment my mother noticed the binder, her smile faded. What is that? Documentation. The room immediately grew uncomfortable. My father sighed. Victoria, we're here to settle this. I agree. I sat down and placed the binder on the table. Then I handed copies to everyone. People looked confused at first. Then they saw the title. The Hayes Family Financial History, 10 Years of Lies. Nobody spoke. Pages began turning. The room grew quieter with each minute. I didn't need to explain much. The documents did it for me. Years of financial bailouts, money transferred to Chloe, my college fund withdrawals, the lake cabin ownership records. Everything was there. Every claim supported by evidence, every date documented, every lie connected to a paper trail. At first, my mother tried to interrupt. Then she stopped, because there was nothing she could dispute. The proof was sitting in everyone's hands. I watched expressions change around the table. Confusion, surprise, disbelief, then understanding. The relatives who had judged me at Christmas suddenly looked very different. Several wouldn't even meet my eyes. Then Daniel spoke. His voice was quiet. My parents already offered $50,000 for the wedding. The room went silent again. He looked directly at Chloe. Why didn't you tell anyone? Chloe stared at the table. No answer, no excuse, nothing, because every answer made the situation worse. My father removed his glasses and rubbed his face. For the first time since Christmas, he looked tired. Not angry, not defensive, just tired. My mother finally looked at me. We were trying to help your sister. I nodded. I know. For a second she looked relieved. Then I continued. You helped her with my future. The room froze. Nobody argued. Nobody defended her. Because everyone understood exactly what I meant. The college fund, the cabin, the years of unequal treatment, all of it. For years I believed there wasn't enough money. The records proved otherwise. There had been money. It just hadn't been spent equally. My aunt slowly closed her copy of the binder. I had no idea. Neither had most of the people in the room. They had only heard my mother's version. Now they were seeing the facts, and facts are much harder to argue with. I looked around the table, then directly at my parents. I'm not asking for money. Nobody spoke. I'm not filing lawsuits. Still silence. I'm here because you told me I owed Chloe. I paused. I don't. That was the moment the argument ended, not because anyone agreed, because nobody could prove otherwise. The documents had already won. My father looked down at the table, then finally spoke. 3 words. I was wrong. The room remained silent. I had imagined hearing those words for years. Strangely, they didn't feel satisfying. They just felt overdue. I nodded once, then closed the binder. The sound echoed through the room. For weeks, my family had been trying to convince me to pay for a wedding. Now everyone understood the wedding had never been the real issue. The real issue was 10 years of favoritism, 10 years of excuses, 10 years of lies. I stood and picked up the binder. Nobody tried to stop me. Nobody argued. Nobody called me selfish. Those voices had disappeared the moment the evidence appeared. As I reached the doorway, Daniel stopped me. Victoria. I turned. He looked genuinely embarrassed. I'm sorry. I gave him a small nod. This wasn't your lie. Then I walked out, and for the first time since Christmas dinner, I felt like the truth finally belonged to everyone, not just me. The days after the family meeting were surprisingly quiet. No angry phone calls, no arguments, no relatives demanding explanations. For the first time in weeks, nobody was trying to pressure me into anything. The truth had done what arguments never could. It had ended the debate. A week later, Daniel called. He apologized for everything that had happened. I told him the same thing I'd said before. This wasn't your lie. Not long after, Chloe reached out. For the first time in her life, she admitted something simple. She had spent years expecting people to rescue her, because that was what she'd been taught. It wasn't an excuse, but it was honest. My father called next. There were no speeches, no attempts to defend himself. Just 3 words I should have heard years earlier. I was wrong. My mother took longer. Admitting mistakes had never been easy for her. But eventually she apologized too. Not perfectly, not dramatically, just honestly. As for the wedding, it became much smaller, much more realistic. And for the first time, it was funded by the people getting married, not by someone else. Several months later, Chloe transferred half ownership of the lake cabin back to me. The first truly fair decision she had made in years. I didn't ask for it, she simply did it. Today the binder sits in a closet. I haven't opened it in a long time. I don't need to, because this story was never really about $93,000. It wasn't about a wedding, and it wasn't even about money. It was about truth. For years, my family told one story. The records told another. Eventually, those stories collided, and only one survived. My grandfather used to tell me something whenever we worked through numbers together. Numbers don't care who gets angry. Back then, I thought it was just an accountant's favorite saying. Now I understand what he meant. People can argue. People can deny. People can rewrite history. But facts are patient. Sooner or later, they speak for themselves. And when they do, even 10 years of lies can disappear in a single afternoon. That was the day my parents demanded $93,000 for my sister's wedding. And the day the truth finally caught up with them. Not because I got revenge, not because I won, but because the facts spoke louder than the story they had been telling for years. And in the end, that was enough.